The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
A very warm welcome to this Monday edition of Squawk Box. I'm Steve Sedgwick with Karen Cho live in Barcelona at the Mobile World Congress. These are your headlines. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer calls for a coalition of the willing after talks between the US and Ukraine dramatically collapse, leaving Ukrainians reeling about the future of the war.
The discussions we've had today, particularly the coalition of the willing, is on the basis that this is a plan that we will work with the US and that it will have US backing.
Crypto prices surge after President Donald Trump details his strategic reserve plans, including Bitcoin and smaller tokens, in a bid to, quote, elevate this critical industry. Asian equities, broadly rise as investors await clarity on President Trump's plan to impose tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China this week, whilst the White House launches a probe into the lumber market.
Europe's regulatory environment is not fit for purpose, according to Deutsche Telekom CEO Tim Höttges, who tells CNBC the bloc has to respond to increased global competition.
Europe has to wake up. We are losing our sovereignty and we will lose our benchmark if we are not acting now quickly.
Chinese EV makers snap up market share, with sales at Tesla rival BYD soaring over 160% annually last month.
Well, good morning, everyone. I think it's fair to say that since the last time we were on air, events have been staggering on the global stage as well. Who can have not been aghast or amazed or astonished by the events in the Oval Office on Friday evening? Quite extraordinary, unprecedented and historic times, whatever side of the political divide you are on. Well, in reaction to that, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer says European leaders now have agreed to draw up a plan for peace in Ukraine to present to the United States. Starmer said countries, including the UK and France, would join others in a, quote, coalition of the willing to contribute military support to defend any future ceasefire agreement. They will also raise defence spending, with the Prime Minister announcing an additional £1.6 billion of UK export finance for Ukraine to buy defence missiles. Speaking to the newspaper Le Figaro, French President Emmanuel Macron said the plan would include an initial 1 month partial truce between Russia and Ukraine. Now, this would cover air, sea and energy infrastructure. Well, Mr. Starmer said he is confident the plan would win the support of President Trump.
The US has been a reliable ally to the UK for many, many decades and continues to be. There are no two countries as closely aligned as our two countries, and our defence, our security and intelligence is intertwined in a way no two other countries are. So it's an important and reliable ally for us. The discussions we've had today, particularly the coalition of the willing, is on the basis that this is a plan that we will work with the US and that it will have US backing.
The Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni met Starmer ahead of the summit, calling for unity.
We are all very committed about a goal that we all want to achieve, which is a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. I think it is very, very important that we avoid the risk that the West divides. And I think on this, UK and Italy can play an important role in bridge building, let's say. Yeah. So you know that I've been also proposing a meeting between US and European leaders for if we divide ourselves, that will make us all weaker.
Well, I'll just make the point about Meloni there as well, and it's something we actually discussed in the newsroom this morning as well. Meloni was the first of the European leaders when Trump was elected, seen as the bridge with Washington, now perhaps ceded that role slightly to Macron and Starmer. Why would that have happened as well? Well, Italy's in an awkward position. They don't even spend 2% of GDP at the moment as well. Now, whilst Meloni was seen initially as close to the administration, if the Italians aren't spending 2% of their GDP on defence as well, it puts them as one of the countries in the firing line. So you can see the awkward position that Giorgia Meloni is in there as well. And also another leader who hasn't committed, we understand, to peacekeeping troops in Ukraine. The London summit took on extra significance, of course, after White House talks between President Donald Trump and the Vice President Vance and the Ukrainian president, and various reporters as well, descended into argument before the world's media, perhaps egged on by one or two of that world media. In a tense Oval Office meeting, Trump and Zelensky had been expected to finalise an economic agreement over Ukrainian critical minerals, but the talks fell apart. A press conference was cancelled after this exchange.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems. Even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. Remember this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country, that's backed you far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said? Look, before we get to the next guest, let's be brutally honest. This kind of debate goes on all the time between world leaders. It probably happens in the Oval Office every single week. But the fact that this happened in front of the world's press, in front of the world TV audience, a US TV audience, is quite extraordinary and unprecedented. That's the unprecedented thing about this as well. Let's get some expert opinion. Gesine Weber is a fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Gesine, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I have one simple, very easy question for you. First of all, what do you make of all this?
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for having me for this discussion. In fact, we see that Europeans now really see the need to take the lead on support for Ukraine, especially as the tensions between the US and Ukraine could not be higher, and because European security is, of course, directly impacted by what is happening. I think it is interesting to see that the UK is taking the lead here with the summit that we just saw in London this weekend, because on the one hand, it has these very strong historic tie with the United States, but has also been a staunch supporter of Ukraine since the very beginning of the war. So the Prime Minister should indeed be in a very good position. So now we are basically in a wait-and-see position to what extent Washington can be brought on board for this plan that they might be presenting.
But Gesine, let me just maybe gently probe one of the first points you said there. Europe must take the lead in support for Ukraine. My understanding is that Europe has spent the same, if not more, money on the United States anyway supporting Ukraine. Now, it cannot match the US militarily. That is without doubt. US intelligence, US patriots, US munitions will far outnumber and outdo the Europeans on any front at the moment for the foreseeable future. But in terms of total support for Ukraine, I thought the Europeans were already outspending the Americans.
Yes, they are. But the support for Ukraine is, of course, on the one hand about the financial and military support, but it is also really about the strategic support and about thinking about how the country can be secure in the future and also be shielded from future attacks from Russia. And it is very clear that there is very little willingness at the moment in the United States to either provide security guarantees or to open the door for NATO membership. So all this is going to fall on Europeans, and it is precisely here where they now need to step up. So basically, it is a now or never moment for European security and defense.
But security guarantees, funny enough, I raised this very issue with President Zelensky in Vilnius at the NATO summit a couple of years ago. And I raised this exact point. I said, what use are security guarantees if the security guarantees that you obtained from the great powers, so to speak, in the Budapest memorandum, in the wake of the falling of the wall, what if they weren't honoured? What good are security guarantees? And I'll add that to the fact that actually a very senior Ukrainian told me very recently that actually the idea of being a full member of NATO is a figment of imagination. So how does this go forward if security guarantees haven't been backed up beforehand, and we've seen this from Minsk as well, and two, that NATO is just a figment of the imagination?
Yeah, so let's be very honest. I think we are all pretty clear-eyed that NATO membership for Ukraine, especially with the current US administration, seems more or less off the table. So if the United States does not want to provide a bilateral security guarantee for Ukraine, they also do not want to open the door for NATO membership, because that is an institutionalized security guarantee. So this is not going to come. Then the question is, of course, every security guarantee always depends on the one that is backing that up, and how serious they are, and also how much they regard implementing the security guarantee as a considerable and important part of their own security. And I'm pretty sure that if Europeans decided to provide security guarantees to Ukraine, that is something that is genuinely in the European interest, because you don't know where Putin would be going to stop. So basically, you need a security guarantee with an ironclad commitment, because that is the best deterrence against Russia.
Gesine, there are two parts to the story. One, the part of you supporting Ukraine. Two, the part of actually Europe getting serious about its own defence. I have enormous amounts of sympathy with Donald Trump about Europe not defending itself, not spending enough money on defending itself as well. I raised the example of Italy before I came to you as well. But quite frankly, whether it's Italian debt at the moment, French debt in the town that you're in Paris and elsewhere, or even the Germans and their attitude to debt, is there really a sea change, apart from what they are saying and virtue signalling? Is there a sea change now in what the Europeans will actually be spending on their own defence?
So at the moment, we have seen that European defence funding has climbed up since 2022, but we also know that it is most likely not enough. And for that, we will all have our eyes on the Special European Council on Thursday, which is precisely dedicated to the questions of security and European defence. And especially the European Union will have to play a crucial role, because in light of the individual debt that a lot of the European countries are facing, a massive push of funding from the European Union will be needed. One option would be excluding national defence funding from the EU debt criteria. Another option would be joint borrowing at the financial markets and basically common debt, so-called Eurobonds for defense, which has also been done, for example, for the economic support after the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, fascinating, Gesine, because, of course, the Poles have wanted option one for a long time because of their huge deficit spending on defence as well. And the Germans, as you know better than I will ever know, have issues with option two. So it will be fascinating to see the progress made. Thank you very much indeed for your insight this morning. I do appreciate it. Gesine Weber, who is a fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Mr. Trump will deliver his first address to a joint session of Congress since his return to the White House on Tuesday. The president is expected to lay out his plans for the coming year and address sweeping cuts made to the federal government, whilst global leaders will also be looking for any comments, of course, on the war in Ukraine. Let's get out to Karen, who is in Barcelona.
Steve, plenty coming up on the show. We take a look back at the month in markets, in particular with fortunes split either side of the Atlantic. Plus, monthly sales accelerate at Chinese EV makers amid robust domestic demand. We'll bring you those numbers. And we'll also bring you Charlotte's exclusive interview with the L'Oreal CEO as the group unveils its new research and innovation centre. China's manufacturing activity grew at the fastest pace in 3 months in February, thanks to new orders and higher purchase volumes. The official manufacturing PMI came in at 50.2 last month, up from 49.1 in January. A private Caixin survey also showed growth, with the manufacturing PMI rising to 50.8. The annual meeting of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference starts on Tuesday. That will be followed by the opening of the National People's Congress, where investors will be looking out for growth and fiscal deficit targets seen at 5% and 4% respectively.
Right, let's move on and take a look at the Asian equity markets and where they are currently trading. And look at this, despite the oscillation and huge amount of political news, not a jot of movement really on the Hang Seng and the mainland Shanghai Composite as well. We do have the topics in Japan and the Nikkei both up by, well, that's extraordinary, isn't it? Exactly the same margin, 1.61%. US markets at the tail end of last week, they actually rallied hard. Take a look at this. We've seen the all three major indices led by, well, pretty much it was broad brush, but actually it was financials that led the market rather than technology as a whole. Financials were up 2.1% on Friday. But as you can see, technology, big rally, 1.6%, and indeed the broader S&P up by a similar margin. The US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says Mexico has offered to match US tariffs on China to avoid duties threatened by President Trump, with Bessent calling on Canada to follow suit in an interview with Bloomberg. A 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico is scheduled to come into effect tomorrow, although Trump has indicated the final amount could be different. The president has also ordered a new trade investigation that could result in tariffs on lumber imports. Whilst the White House trade advisor Peter Navarro accused lumber exporters, including, yes, you guessed it, Canada, Germany and Brazil, of, quote, dumping lumber into our markets. US PCE inflation came in at 2.5% on the year in January. That is up 30 basis points on the month as expected. Meanwhile, core inflation eased to 2.6% on the year, down from 2.9% in December. We've got some end-of-month boards for you as well, actually. So let's just show you this. And despite the rally you can see on the S&P on Friday, this is pretty much the chart we showed you for the previous month on Friday. But as you can see, a quite extraordinary outperformance of the Euro stocks in Europe versus the S&P 500. And the point is the same here. Despite all those macro concerns out there, Europe found a floor and the US wavered somewhat. But with just under 5% outperformance for the European blue chips. Let's take a look at the Nasdaq, though, in February. Again, a huge oscillation, a little bit of a rally on Friday's trade, as I mentioned there as well. But Nvidia for the month actually rallied, which again, given everything that was thrown at it with the deep-seat concerns and what have you, it rallied hard. I mean, the standouts there, I would suggest on that chart, are Google, down 16.5%, and Tesla down 27.6%. Now, we've already mentioned the Chinese EV sales. We don't have a breakdown of Tesla's EV sales for the month of February as of yet, but certainly all the other major manufacturers. Just following on from what we saw with the SAIC figures coming out of Europe, SAIC sales as part of a broader EV rally were quite extraordinary. We've seen similar moves for BYD and others over in China. We don't have a figure for Tesla, but by and large, there's a lot of concern, isn't there, at the moment about Tesla EV sales for a multitude of reasons. Let's take a look at auto and defence names as well. European bourses first, I beg your pardon. But 1.6% higher for the FTSE in the month of February. The standout there clearly being the Italian blue chips. Okay, let's have a look at those defence names and the autos now. Big rally, of course, for the defence name. That's Hensoldt, and we spoke to the management of that company on Friday. Rheinmetall up 33%. Rolls-Royce. Now, that's not the car manufacturer. I keep telling you it's the engine manufacturer. There was a huge amount of love of that stock with the buyback and extra divvy coming back onto the market there. 23% rally in February. Elsewhere, the autos, more of a patchy performance. The second from bottom name you can see on the screen is Stellantis, down 4.6%. Let's get to David Roche, who is a strategist at Quantum Strategy. And David, you can talk about so many things, I know. So it's hard to quantify. But why don't we start off actually where we finished off with Gesine Weber as well. And I must ask you, like I'm asking everyone at the moment, what do you make of what happened on Friday in the Oval Office?
Well, I won't comment on the behavior or human decency. I'll comment on the results. It seems to me NATO is dead. The US is now allied with NATO. Putin's getting rewarded. And because he's getting rewarded with everything he fought for, he'll be back in a war within Europe again within 3 years. Now, Europe will pretend this isn't happening and that NATO isn't dead. Why will they do that? Because one, they want to fund Ukraine and supply it with arms from America, which they can't replace. And secondly, they want to buy time to build a European military, which will take 5 or 6 years, probably longer, as you will need to replace a lot of the software involved in NATO and infrastructure, which we don't have. And without it, we'll be using US weapons and we won't be autonomous. So that's what's going to happen. Now, we have a deal out of the meeting which happened yesterday, which I would describe as suffering from the fawning spaniel syndrome. The fawning spaniel syndrome. And the reason for that is because it's designed never to cross a red line which might upset Trump. The Europeans aren't at the table. The US is not involved in defending Ukraine after the so-called peace. And effectively what you're looking at is a coalition of the willing. Well, we had a coalition of the willing. I thought it was called NATO. So the fact that you're saying you need another one to look at to defend Ukraine, it means NATO's not working. So here we are. Now, will Trump buy on this, and will the pretense of NATO surviving last? I think Trump has to be careful. Without the Europeans and the Ukrainians signing the deal, he's looking at Kabul, because it will be an American withdrawal with the Ukrainians and the Europeans standing fast. That's not peace through strength by any definition. So he may go along with this. But look, the big winners, who are they? It's Putin and Xi, who see democracy as declining, and it's confirmed. Even in my book, it looks decadent. The question is, will Xi test Taiwan in a period when the US troops, which Trump will withdraw from Europe sooner or later, haven't arrived yet? I think he will test Taiwan. So we get a new theater of kind of tension and conflict, probably something like putting an embargo around the country. And the big loser is actually the US, because nobody will trust the US treaty again. So a lot of global South countries will fall into the Chinese ambit as a result. And Europe will get to spend another, I think, 2 to 2.5% of GDP on defense. So you want to buy defense, you want to keep out of the euro and own the yen, which is now the new safe haven, as the US is getting to look very dangerous, and US exceptionalism will suffer from the costs of Trump's commercial tariffs. And wait for April, and we'll have another 25% tariffs on European goods from Trump, which will certainly cement, I think, the transatlantic partnership.
David, there's a lot in there, and you and I would wonderfully debate this for the next 3 hours and beyond as well. But I want to compare this to late 1930s Britain and, dare I say it, whatever was left of the Western Alliance in the late 1930s. A lot of people criticised Chamberlain's government as well for not taking the threat of Nazism seriously as well. Well, they were taking it seriously. They were rearming off a very, very low base in the mid-1930s to a very high level by the end of the 1930s, way before Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. But they did what they could. So whilst there was overtly a policy of appeasement, which they were hugely criticised for, and probably history has judged them correctly, the fact of the matter is they were rearming furiously in the late 1930s. You mentioned that NATO is dead, or Article 5 is dead pretty much as a de facto defence, with the US involved as well. Europe has an opportunity now to rearm aggressively. It now has a NATO which has Sweden and Finland in, with a lot more larger land border against the Russians than the Russians have ever had in the history of NATO as well. Europe is taking its defence more seriously, isn't it?
Oh, look, I'm not disputing that. It's taking its defence more seriously since last week. But it was told to do so since 2007 by George Bush. So it's a little bit slow in reacting.
David, that's not accurate. David, Europe has upped defence spending aggressively since 2018, since the lambasting of Frau Merkel and Jens Stoltenberg in 2018. If you look at the number who were getting to 2% back in 2018, it was a fraction. Now it is most NATO members, David.
Yes, but what I'm saying is the 2% was set and agreed in 2007, first of all, not in 2014 in Wales. And the reality is that, of course, our defense expenditure has gone up 30%. It has gone up to approximately 300 billion euro a year, but it needs to go up by at least 200 billion more fast. That's what I'm saying. Now, the reason why this is not, I'm not casting moral aspersions, but I'm saying the defense spending is not where it has to be to replace the Americans. It has to be much, much higher. It's very slow. And the reason it's slow is because it's not just about tanks and soldiers. It's about the integration of those 22 different armies in NATO into a combined operating force. And of course, beyond that, it is about establishing supply chains for the hardware and software used by the military, which has to be local to give Europe strategic autonomy. What I'm saying is that takes 5 to 6 years minimum. And what I'm saying, Putin, who can build the entire armament of the German Bundeswehr every 6 months, can rearm much faster. He has been rewarded for his aggression. He has his imperialistic dreams. Why is he going to wait? He's not going to wait. It's a different syndrome to 1938. It's not about moral blame. It's about the practicalities of arming.
David, that's an alarming strategy. Let me just bring out some more of the intel that you're sharing with us today, where you mentioned Europe will no longer align with the US and on China policy. This is extraordinary because what we've seen has been the US and Europe in lockstep around technology, in particular chips, that has tried to slow China down when it comes to AI. And of course, we've seen it around telecommunications. I'm at Mobile World Congress, and that's been such a dominant theme around Huawei and the pushback from the West for a number of years. So what are the consequences if we see Europe split from the United States when it comes to China policy?
Well, I think there will be protections against Europe, but it will be there already. The point here is that China is seeing the US creating soft power vacuums in the world by shutting down its aid and everything else, and losing its allies because of the question of trust. So the Chinese will come along and be very nice to Europe, and they will say to Europe, look, we'll put all our technology into Europe and you'll gain from that. We'll make EV cars, which are entirely made, the entire supply chain in Europe, and you'll gain from that. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we went back to doing business together? As Europe will be being shut out of the United States, has no reason to kowtow to that alliance or to actually conduct its economic policy so that it's matched with its security policy. It will switch. They're not going to say it's going to switch tomorrow morning. They're going to continue to say we have to protect our industries against Chinese pricing and competitiveness, basically. But as you go forward in time, particularly if this relationship gets more bilious and more poisonous with the United States, which could happen tomorrow morning if Trump says, okay, well, I don't need the Europeans in this thing. They can go to hell. It could happen like that. At that point in time, within a year, of course, the policy vis-a-vis China will change, and China will be there smiling at the doorstep to help us.
David, thank you so much for joining us today. We must let you go. It's a packed on show, but we do appreciate very strong points you're making this morning. David Roche with our strategist, Quantum Strategy. Let's push on to some numbers that have been crossing from China. The Chinese EV makers reported another month of strong sales growth amid robust demand in the world's second largest economy. XPeng led the pack, posting a 570% annual increase in February, boosted by new models, while BYD saw sales jump more than 160% on the year. Thank you for listening to Squawk Box Europe Express.
For more market-moving news, you can head to CNBC.com.
Or join us again on the show with Steve Sedgwick, Karen Cho, and myself, Arabile Kumete, weekdays on CNBC.